What if the fall of a regime didn't come with gunfire, but with a whisper? What if power slipped through fingers, not in rage, but in silence? At 3:12 a.m., Ivory Coast changed forever, and no one even heard it coming. No sirens, no explosions, just absence. And across the border in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré received a handwritten note, 6 words that stopped him cold. Abidjan has risen. Are you ready? He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared ahead. Because sometimes revolutions don't shout. They knock quietly, then wait for those bold enough to open the door. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story, in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, and felt that it was not just his fight, but yours too, then this story belongs to you. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support it, but to stand with it. Because we are no longer just observers, we are part of a quiet storm rising together. What began as whispers has become a silent revolution, and so just hours after the world began whispering about Abidjan, something unexpected arrived in Ouagadougou. Not a delegation, not a leaked memo, just a letter, quiet, handwritten, folded with precision. It had no official stamp, no crest, no sender. Only 6 words. Abidjan has risen. Are you ready? Captain Ibrahim Traoré stared at the page in silence. He read it once, then again, then once more, as if the ink might change. But it didn't. Those 6 words said more than any diplomatic cable or televised address ever could. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't summon ministers or generals. Instead, he folded the letter carefully, stood up from the bench beneath the neem tree, and walked alone into the archive wing of the palace. There he pulled out 3 worn files, Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah. Each one a reminder of what was possible and what was stolen. Then, with deliberate calm, Traoré returned to the courtyard and gave a single order: bring the historians. It shocked his aides. No military briefings, no security alerts, but Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not preparing for war. He was preparing for a reckoning. He knew what had happened in Côte d'Ivoire wasn't an accident. It was timing, it was courage. It was a spark, and sparks needed air. Traoré would not let it die. That night, he lit a small lamp in his private study. He opened a blank page, and on the top line in his own handwriting he wrote, "The Sahel will not be silent." The message from Abidjan wasn't a warning, it was a summons. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré had just answered it. 3 days later, without any public announcement, Captain Ibrahim Traoré boarded a black military transport plane. There were no journalists, no flags, no convoy of state cars. He wore no medals, no formal sash. Just his plain desert uniform boots, dusty from the ground, he refused to forget. He didn't leave as a president visiting a neighbor. He left as a soldier answering a call. The world expected a delegation, a press conference, perhaps even a demand. What they got was a silent arrival. No one knew he had landed in Abidjan until the photo leaked Traoré standing face to face with the young transitional leader of Côte d'Ivoire. There was no red carpet, no armed guards, just 2 men, both calm, both silent for a long moment before they embraced. Cameras weren't invited, but someone captured it, 2 leaders surrounded not by power but by purpose. That image spread like wildfire. Across WhatsApp groups, newsrooms, diaspora forums, and with it came one question. What is Captain Ibrahim Traoré doing in Abidjan? He was not there to lecture. He was not there to take control. He was there to listen. For hours he met with civil leaders, teachers, and even street vendors who had helped organize the silent uprising. No suits, no protocol, just truth. He took notes. He asked questions. When one youth activist said, "We didn't overthrow a man, we reclaimed a future," Traoré simply nodded. He understood. Later that night, under the dim light of a converted barracks, He and the transitional president signed a single-page statement. It had no legal jargon, no diplomatic fluff, just a title, the Sahel Accord. It would be announced not with cannons but with clarity. The next morning a short message was broadcast. The future will not be negotiated behind closed doors. The Sahel is speaking now. And just like that, Captain Ibrahim Traoré left Abidjan. No speech, no parade, only impact. He had come not to lead a revolution, but to walk beside one. The day after Captain Ibrahim Traoré left Abidjan, the world woke up to something it hadn't expected. Unity, not chaos. At 6 a.m., a joint declaration was read live on both Ivorian and Burkina state media. No fanfare, no national anthem, just a calm voice and a clear title, the Sahel Accord. It wasn't just an agreement. It was a blueprint written not in the language of old diplomacy, but in the rhythm of new sovereignty. The term stunned analysts. The CFA franc, a colonial relic, would be phased out within 12 months. Both governments committed to open regional audits of all foreign mining infrastructure and defense contracts. A Pan-African Civilian Assembly would be convened in Ouagadougou, made up not of ministers or donors, but of farmers, teachers, youth leaders, and religious elders. And perhaps the most shocking clause, no Western consultant agency or observer would be permitted in the founding stages of this assembly. We will consult with our people before we consult with anyone else. The document read. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's fingerprints were everywhere but not in control and courage. His name wasn't even mentioned once in the broadcast, but no one was fooled. They had seen him arrive. They had watched the handshake. They had heard the silence that followed, and they knew. This was not just about Côte d'Ivoire or Burkina Faso. This was the start of something continental. In Paris, a journalist from Le Monde called it a quiet earthquake. In Washington, foreign policy analysts scrambled to issue risk advisories. In boardrooms across Europe, executives began requesting emergency audits of their African assets. The ground was shifting, and it wasn't from protests. It was from structure. Real, tangible public structure. The kind that didn't ask for permission. Meanwhile, across West Africa, something extraordinary happened. Murals appeared overnight in Dakar, Bamako, and Niamey. One showed Captain Ibrahim Traoré holding a shovel, planting a tree beside a ballot box. Another showed a map of the Sahel, not divided by borders, but connected by threads of fire. And in bright red across one wall in Conakry, a single sentence stretched 20 feet. We are not just a region, we are a voice. Traoré never commented publicly on the murals. He didn't need to. The people understood. The Sahel Accord was not a press stunt. It was a declaration that dignity would no longer be delayed. It was a message to every foreign investor, every consultant, every embassy. The rules have changed, and as Traoré returned to Ouagadougou, he gave only one order. Prepare the forum. The people will speak first. No generals, no scripts, no filtered panels, just raw public African truth. The silence had ended. And it was Captain Ibrahim Traoré who had helped write the first line of what would come next. While murals were spreading across the Sahel, panic was quietly setting in across Europe. In Paris, officials at the Élysée Palace held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Intelligence briefings were rushed. Defense analysts issued alerts. Contracts once thought untouchable were flagged. The French Foreign Ministry's official line was cautious. We are monitoring developments closely. But inside the corridors of power, there was no confusion. This wasn't just another military shuffle. This was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and he was rewriting the game. Traoré hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't threatened anyone. But he had made one thing clear. West Africa would no longer be managed. It would lead. His visit to Abidjan had triggered a chain reaction, not of violence, but of vision. And that terrified the old order. The French military presence in Côte d'Ivoire, long considered a stable foothold, now looked exposed. French firms controlling everything from cocoa exports to construction tenders began freezing their operations. Legal teams worked overnight combing through decades-old contracts, trying to prepare for the inevitable audits. The United States issued its usual neutral line: "We encourage a return to democratic norms." But the statement fell flat, because this time West Africa wasn't descending into chaos. It was rising into coordination. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't demanding respect. He was showing how it's built from the ground up and without apology. In Brussels, diplomats were stunned by the tone of the Sahel Accord. One EU ambassador was overheard saying, "They're not even pretending to need us anymore." That's what made it dangerous. This wasn't rebellion, this was competence. Civilian forums, transparent commissions, economic reforms without IMF advisors. Traoré wasn't replacing one power with another. He was dismantling the entire pyramid. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked through a local market unannounced. No security cordon, no cameras. A vendor selling onions shouted, "We're with you, Capitaine." He nodded, bought a bag, and replied, "Then build with me." It wasn't theater, it was trust. He had become more than a president. He was becoming a symbol, but symbols are dangerous, especially when they spread. In Niger, soldiers began holding silent meetings. In Mali, students submitted a petition demanding a national audit modeled after Burkina Faso's. In Guinea, the prime minister resigned, suddenly citing structural misalignment. In every capital, the same question echoed: what if we followed Traoré's path? And that's what the West feared most, not another coup, but a blueprint. A repeatable, scalable, African-made path to sovereignty. Traoré had not exported violence, he had exported clarity. And as that clarity reached the boardrooms of Paris, the headlines of Washington, and the embassies of Accra, one thing was undeniable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had shifted the balance not through domination, but through demonstration. The age of managing Africa was ending. The age of listening to it had just begun. But even as hope spread, Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew better than to trust silence. "Do not mistake quiet for peace," he warned in a closed-door briefing. "The silence of our enemies is not surrender, it's strategy." He had seen it before. Revolutions didn't collapse under pressure. They were poisoned slowly from within. And that's why, while the world focused on the Sahel Accord, he launched something else entirely, Operation Shield. It wasn't announced. It wasn't televised. It was whispered, planned, and executed with surgical precision. A covert task force, handpicked, multilingual, and loyal only to the people, began tracking unusual movements in the diplomatic zones of Ouagadougou and Abidjan, flights arriving at odd hours, electronic equipment delivered with no customs clearance, foreign consultants staying in unregistered residences. Something was off. Then the first intercept came in an encrypted message between two Western contractors working for a major development agency in Côte d'Ivoire. The subject line read, "Project Reset." The content was chilling outlines of a media campaign to discredit the Transitional Council bribe, offers to opposition figures, and even logistical plans to trigger unrest near gold mining sites. It wasn't just sabotage. It was strategy-engineered destabilization dressed as diplomacy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read the file himself. He didn't explode. He didn't curse. He simply closed the folder and said, "They're still playing the old game. Let's show them we've changed the board." That same night, 3 foreign operatives were quietly deported. Their names were never released. No press coverage, no public humiliation. Traoré wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in security. At the same time, Operation Shield expanded. A digital defense unit was activated to monitor and neutralize online disinformation campaigns. Bank transactions linked to offshore accounts were quietly flagged. Local media outlets were supported, not censored, with funding for investigative journalism and public forums. Traoré wasn't silencing dissent. He was amplifying truth. When a rumor surfaced that he planned to dissolve all future elections, He addressed it directly, not through an official spokesperson, but in a live town hall with students in Bobo Dioulasso. "We are not here to cancel democracy," Captain Ibrahim Traoré said. "We are here to protect its roots, so it no longer grows in the shade of foreign trees." The room went silent. Then it erupted in applause. And just like that, the counterattack failed. Project Reset. Dissolved in real time, not with arrests or violence, but with exposure and resistance. The lesson was clear: Burkina Faso, and now Côte d'Ivoire, were no longer soft targets. They were awake, aware, and defended from within. What frightened their opponents most wasn't the army. It was the alignment. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had built something rare in African politics: momentum without ego change, without blood, and leadership without dependence. The silence had returned, but this time it belonged to them. And so, as the dust settled over Abidjan and the heat returned to the streets of Ouagadougou, something deeper than a coup had taken root. It was not just a transfer of power, nor the end of one regime. It was the quiet birth of a new political imagination, one shaped not by outside pressures or inherited scripts, but by the will of the people and the integrity of those bold enough to listen. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not raise a flag over another capital. He did not install allies. He simply walked into a moment in history and helped it move forward without asking permission. That in itself was revolutionary. In the months that followed, the world watched with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. There were no mass arrests, no sweeping purges, no hunger for control. Instead, there were public assemblies broadcast live. Farmers debated with economists. Young people challenged retired generals. Women from rural cooperatives sat alongside constitutional scholars. It was messy, it was uncomfortable, but it was real. Democracy, for the first time in years, didn't feel like an imported word. It felt like a living one. Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso, not with celebration but with responsibility. He resumed his duties quietly. No victory speech, no political theater. But something had shifted in his eyes. Witnessing Côte d'Ivoire's rise reminded him of how fragile yet powerful civic awakening can be. He doubled down on reforms at home, opening regional forums, expanding civic education, and most importantly, preparing his country for a future where power belonged not to uniforms, but to citizens. Internationally, reactions grew more layered. Some Western officials continued to express concern, framing events in the language of instability and uncertainty. But behind those diplomatic phrases was something far simpler: fear. Not of violence, but of a new political model they could not control. A model where Africa asked no one for permission. A model where the words of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, calm, precise, grounded, carried more weight than any foreign press release. Meanwhile, in places long forgotten by global headlines, villages without power, schools without books, clinics without medicine, a quiet sense of ownership began to take root. People no longer waited for change to come from the top. They organized, they questioned, they built. In Abidjan, an artist painted a mural of a young girl planting a flag, her other hand holding a book instead of a gun. In Ouagadougou, school children recited poems titled "The Nation That Spoke." The shift was cultural, not just political. The Sahel was no longer a battlefield of ideologies. It was becoming a workshop of ideas. Traoré, ever cautious of being turned into a symbol, reminded his advisors again and again, "Do not let them make this about me. Make it about what we can build." He refused statues. He declined renaming streets. His face was never plastered across billboards. Instead, he redirected resources into digitizing land titles for farmers and securing clean water systems in desert regions. These acts did not make global news, but they made local lives better, and for Traoré that was the point. By the end of the year, whispers of similar reforms began echoing in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and even Senegal. The model was catching on, not as a wave of military takeovers, but as a return to grounded, community-driven sovereignty. It was not a virus. It was a vaccine against corruption dependency and political theater. And through it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained steady. He knew the road ahead would be hard. He knew enemies, both foreign and domestic, would adapt. He didn't claim final victory, he claimed responsibility. "Revolutions are not events," he said in a speech to university graduates. "They are decisions repeated every day in silence." And maybe that's why this story matters. Because it wasn't told through sirens or gunfire. It was told through decisions, through trust, through the refusal to be ruled by fear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just stand with Côte d'Ivoire. He stood for something bigger, the right of a continent to define its own dignity. No headlines captured that moment. But history will. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story in its own language on its own soil, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and understood it's not just about him, but about all of us, then this story belongs to you. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to stand with a movement. This is more than content. It's a call. We are no longer whispering in the shadows. We are rising through the silence, because what started as a murmur has now become a quiet storm. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the silent revolution that swept from Burkina Faso to Côte d'Ivoire is more than just a political event. It is a lesson in how dignity, vision, and courage can reshape the course of history without firing a single shot. It teaches us that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and then moves with precision. In a continent often painted with the broad brushstrokes of chaos and fragility, this story reminds us that Africa is not just a land of resources. It is a land of reason, of resolve, and of renaissance. One of the most profound lessons is the redefinition of leadership. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not arrive in Abidjan with an army. He did not demand attention. He didn't even speak much. Instead, he embodied the rarest form of leadership presence without dominance, strength without intimidation, and wisdom without arrogance. He showed that leadership is not about occupying space, but about creating space for dialogue, for trust, for people to reclaim what was always theirs. The story also offers a powerful critique of performative democracy. For decades, African nations have been told to follow Western models of governance, often under the guise of aid, debt relief, or partnership. But what we saw in this story was something radically different: democracy, not as theater, but as architecture, built slowly, locally, and with the voices of those who had previously been ignored. Traoré and the Transitional Council in Côte d'Ivoire didn't chase approval from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. They looked inward to the farmers, teachers, youth, and faith leaders who had the most to gain or lose from change. That shift in direction is a lesson to every emerging nation. Sovereignty cannot be subcontracted. Another key lesson lies in the method of resistance. Traoré did not counter foreign influence with nationalism or violence. He countered it with competence, with clean audits, civic assemblies, transparent timelines, and grassroots mobilization. This was not a rejection of the West, but a rejection of exploitation. It proved that the best way to disarm interference is not with bullets, but with institutions that cannot be bought. It was a form of soft power that demanded attention, not because it was loud, but because it was organized. In that organization lies a profound truth: systems fail when people stop believing in them, but they rise again when people are invited to rebuild them. Traoré's strategy also taught us the importance of narrative control. In previous coups, the headlines were written elsewhere, but here the messaging was local, authentic, and precise. Every mural, every broadcast, every town hall told a story not of conquest, but of correction. The language was not militant, but moral. "We are not here to rule, we are here to reset." Became more than a slogan, it became a guiding principle. That kind of messaging, rooted in shared values, rather than personal ambition, is how movements mature into moments of national clarity. This story also reminds us that accountability is not just a legal process, it is an emotional one. When the transitional government began investigating ghost contracts, offshore accounts, and missing public funds, they did not turn it into a witch hunt. They turned it into a mirror. People across the region, from school teachers to street vendors, began connecting their daily struggles, no books in classrooms, no oxygen in hospitals, to the very names being listed in leaked financial documents. That connection between suffering and corruption is often spoken about in theory. But here it was made visible, it was made personal, and because of that, the call for justice was no longer abstract, it was urgent. Perhaps the most unexpected lesson of all came in how Captain Ibrahim Traoré handled momentum. Most revolutionary figures, when given a surge of popular support, consolidate power. But Traoré did the opposite. He stepped back. He refused to run for office. He refused to appear on posters. He let the process speak for itself. In a world where ego often derails reform, his humility became a safeguard. His refusal to be idolized allowed the movement to outgrow him. That's not just leadership, it's legacy building. On the international stage, this story challenges long-held assumptions about Africa's role in global politics. For too long, African countries have been treated as problems